There's a peculiar moment that happens when a franchise survives long enough. It stops chasing relevance and starts negotiating with it. The early entries feel dangerous, unpredictable, almost reckless in how they push against audience expectations. There's a sense that anything can happen, that the film is slightly ahead of you. But then, as the years pass, something shifts. Familiarity creeps in, the edges soften, and what once felt like a provocation begins to resemble routine. The surprises feel less like shocks and more like obligations. Horror franchises are especially vulnerable to this transformation. After all, they're built on repetition, yet depend on reinvention to justify their existence. The mask stays the same, the rules evolve. And the audience keeps coming back, hoping to fill that same initial jolt. That's the power of nostalgia, after all. And sometimes it works, and sometimes, well, you get an entry that doesn't just struggle to evolve, but feels quietly afraid of standing still. That's the case of the subject of today's episode, where I will expose what happens when a series outstays its welcome. I'm Pedro from Vinyl and Celluloid, and this is my review of Scream 7. When Wes Craven adapted Kevin Williamson's script in 1996, he didn't just revive the slasher film, he rewired it. Scream turned familiarity into tension. It made the audience complicit. Knowing the rules didn't protect you, it implicated you. And for a while, the franchise kept that momentum. Each entry arrived with a clear target, delivering meta-commentary on sequels, media sensationalism, violence and its relationship with reality, Hollywood's own machinery, reboots, requels, sequels, legacy culture, and even the audience itself. There was always something in the crosshairs. But when you're steering a whodunit empire that has produced more secret relatives and revenge-motivated associates than the whole 9 seasons of Dynasty, depletion isn't a possibility, it's a certainty. And Scream 7 feels like that moment. The moment when certainty finally caught up with the series. Some will argue that this is the first entry without a target. I don't buy that. The target is still there. It's just uncomfortable, because it's the creator himself. The screenwriter stepping behind the camera, trying to revive the very franchise he helped to create. Because the challenge is no longer about dissecting horror. It's about proving there's still something left to dissect. But before we get into what fails and what actually worked, let's go over the usual recap section. Scream 7 brings Sidney Prescott back, and for a moment that feels like enough. Years removed from the Ghostface attacks that define her life, she's settled, family-focused, as close to ordinary as someone with her history is ever going to get. But it doesn't hold. A new series of murders begins, deliberate, precise, unmistakably tied to the original Woodsboro killings. The echoes aren't accidental. Someone is once again recreating the past, and they're using Sidney's story to do it. Modern tools, digital manipulation, and a killer who understands that controlling the narrative is just as effective as controlling the knife. And like Al Pacino's character in The Godfather Part 3, she's pulled back in. A new group of younger characters orbits the investigation. Familiar faces reappear in unfamiliar roles, and slowly the mystery shifts. Not just who the killer is, but why someone would want to keep the Ghostface legend alive in the first place. On paper, this is a strong premise. A final girl confronting what her own myth has become. The gap between who she is and how the world has chosen to remember her. But the problem is actually what the film does with this. Scream 7 is built on the premise of an iconic return. No, I'm not talking about Sidney Prescott, and I'm also not talking about a certain character. I'm talking about Kevin Williamson, the man who created it all 30 years ago. Not as the writer, but as the director. And this would be enough to sound like a full circle moment. But in reality, it exposes the gap between understanding a franchise and being able to execute it. Mind you that Williamson's legacy as a writer is undeniable. In the 1990s, in the space of just a few years, he helped resurrect and modernize the slasher genre. First with Scream and Scream 2, then with the pure slasher I Know What You Did Last Summer, and also with the sci-fi thriller The Faculty. He even contributed, though not credited, to one of the finest entries in the Halloween series, Halloween H2O. The man didn't just revive the genre. it gave it a brain. But writing and creating is very different from directing. It's a whole different discipline. And Williamson had already proved he wasn't up for the task. His debut behind the camera in 1999, with Teaching Mrs. Tingle, was a critical and commercial failure. A film that exposed exactly what his limitations were: pacing, tension, visual control, and consistency. In this sense, Scream 7 is less of a return to directing or a second chance, but actually a continuation of the same problem, almost 3 decades later. The film that we got this year lacks build-up. Tension appears and disappears, set pieces feel abrupt, almost as if they exist because they're required, rather than because they've been carefully constructed. And the editing is simply appalling. For a franchise built on precision, this one feels strangely loose. Visually, it doesn't help. The staging is flat, functional, occasionally bordering on TV-level efficiency. There's really no sense of atmosphere, tightening around the characters. No proper escalation, and even tonally, I don't think the title ever settles. It swings between trying to recreate too hard the energy of the 1996 original and dealing with decades of accumulated lore without ever committing to either. The final result is a diluted feature. In many ways, it feels like Williamson is finally bringing to life his original idea and vision for 2000 entry, Scream 3. You can sense that the ambition is still there, but the edge is far gone. The man understands Scream, but this proves he doesn't know how to direct it. Now, this is just one of the many problems the movie has. Because even if the direction held up, the script would have still dragged us down. If we think of Scream as a franchise built on narrative chess, this one feels like checkers. The plot is thin, events happen, characters react, but there's no real sense of progression. No layering, no careful setup that pays off. It feels assembled rather than constructed. In many ways, it repeats all the mistakes that David Gordon Green committed when he tried to resurrect, or at least continue, the Halloween franchise. The dialogue also doesn't help. At times it's so clumsy it feels like it belongs in a straight-to-video 1980s slasher. And the balance between self-awareness and sharpness is gone. Then there's also the violence. The restraint that defined the original is replaced with something louder, more insistent, but far less effective. Mind you that the beer-related kill still works. This is not a spoiler, just a personal comment. I actually had a genuine laugh watching that. But it works mostly because it briefly reminds you of what the franchise used to be. Now, ordinarily, none of this would matter because Sidney Prescott, right? She's back. The safety net, the anchor, the definitive final girl. The only female lead character capable of giving Jamie Lee Curtis's Laurie Strode a run for her money. And yet, she's barely driving the story. She's not even in the passenger seat, mind you. She's somewhere in the back, occasionally reminding you she's still in the car. And that's a problem. And as for Gale Weathers, well, at this point, if it weren't for the dialogue, given the amount of Botox Courtney Cox has had, you'd struggle to read any sort of emotion from her face. In fact, if she weren't dropping F-bombs left and right, you'd hardly know what she was thinking. You kinda half expect the next Ghostface mask killer to be modeled after her. And so without Sidney operating at full force and without a script capable of compensating, the film collapses under its own mythology. And once that happens, the nostalgia aspect that brings people to the movie theaters stops working. And when the execution starts to fall apart, it exposes something deeper. Now, what made this 30-year-old franchise distinct was clarity. Each entry had a target, as I already mentioned, something specific to dismantle. And now the clarity is gone, or so it seems. This is a franchise, after all, that once turned self-awareness into a weapon. And here it becomes decoration, with references instead of commentary. Early entries had intent, but this one feels uncertain. The mystery reflects that. The reveal isn't shocking or clever. It just exists, built backwards for impact rather than constructed through actual setup. And the new characters don't help. They exist within the structure but never elevated. No dynamic, no emotional pull. Sidney and Gale return, but the film doesn't find anything new to say about them. And yes, dropping the Carpenter sisters leaves the continuity feeling incomplete. And at a certain point, this stops being fatigue and it becomes something else. A franchise that once dissected horror now mirrors it. I mentioned that the original hook or angle for this movie was the fact that it had no meta commentary. I think that's actually wrong. and that there's something lurking underneath the surface that's heavily underutilized. Because at its core, this is a story about resurrection, not just of characters, but of IP, of nostalgia, of the idea that nothing is allowed to end. And then the film gives you the clearest possible signal. Ghostface using an AI deepfake of Stu Macher. That should have been the movie. That is the exact target. A franchise interrogating the idea that audiences don't want new stories anymore. They want old ones, resurrected, repackaged, replay. That technology now allows studios to bring back anything, whether it makes sense or not. Instead, this opportunity is brushed off as a gimmick. The film acknowledges it, then retreats from it. And I think this hesitation says everything. Because I think there is a far more interesting film trying to get out. One that reflects not only the Hollywood movie industry, but also audiences. About nostalgia becoming a product with limited appeal. About an industry that increasingly operates like a closed loop, feeding audiences diluted versions of what they already liked. About a creative process that's stuck between the past and scared of the future, namely the impact of AI in content creation. There was still the opportunity to include the real-world context, mind you. You know, the casting fallout, mainly the Melissa Barrera situation, Jenna Ortega walking out, the outrage cycles, the boycotts, and even the holier-than-thou corners of the internet convinced that they can derail a film through hashtags and one-star reviews. The bravest version of Scream 7 would have used all of it. Paramount and the creative powers behind this title should have doubled down on their bet that this movie would have been a hit and point a howitzer at moronic audiences. I think by incorporating this chaos into the story, exposing it, playing with it, the movie would have performed better by bringing not a movement, not a shift, but an amplification of the noise created by systems that reward outrage over consistency. But instead of utilizing all these points, of taking advantage of fan service gone wild, Kevin Williamson chose to barely scratch the surface. Instead, we find an entry in a franchise that's scared of its own Ghostface, one that goes by the name of Irrelevance. And with a projected opening of $60 million this weekend, a franchise high, let's not pretend that Scream 8 isn't coming. The only question is whether the entities behind it will learn anything from this misstep. Now, I'm not a producer nor a screenwriter, nor do I have any affiliation with the franchise. I'm simply a fan, and as a fan, I have some ideas for what could make Scream 8 work. First of all, stop escalating and start interrogating. Give me a character named Mario Argento, a gatekeeping horror purist, someone who actually knows the genre beyond the usual recycled references and titles released less than 10 years ago. Make the trivia actually difficult. Bring in obscure slashers, mentions to Juan Simón Piquer, and make that knowledge matter again. Deliver a meta-commentary around the stupidity and short attention span of Gen Z. Focus the debate around whether horror needs bigger kills and lore, whilst Ghostface tries to force a larger event. Hell, give me killers wearing Gail Weathers' face. At this point, I think it would be the most expressive thing her character has done in years. And better yet, make Tatum, Sidney Prescott's daughter, the killer. The one character who ends the cycle. The one who looks at years of legacy trauma and decides it stops here. Because if Scream is going to survive, it can't keep running away from the same problem. It has to finally face it. And what ultimately sinks Scream 7 isn't the gore or the controversy or even the repetition, is, as I mentioned, the absence of tension. For a franchise built on rules and reversals, this entry feels mechanical. The kills are louder, but rarely suspenseful. The reveals are more convoluted than effective. The film gestures towards reinvention whilst clinging to a formula. That's the irony. A series that once dissected horror with precision now mirrors the machinery it used to mock. And if this proves anything, it's this. The most dangerous thing in horror isn't the killer behind the mask. It's the franchise that refuses to die.